Hey guys, I'm Tom the Tech Chap, and that is the new Mac Studio. Obviously right now all the hype is around the new Apple Vision Pro headset, but that's not for everyone, it's not coming till next year, and right now it's actually the new Mac Studio that I'm most excited about. The thing is, you never know if you're going to get a review sample from Apple, and if you do, there's no telling what spec you're going to get. So I unboxed this, set it up, and then I had a look at the specs, and my jaw dropped a little bit. This is a maxed out Mac Studio. Literally, if you spec out every option, M2 Ultra with the 76-core GPU, all 192 gigabytes of unified memory, and of course 8 terabytes of storage, because external SSDs are for losers, that's the one I have here. All £9,000 or $8,800 of Mac Studio, which is insane. But of course you don't have to spend that much. The Mac Studio starts at around $2,000, which gets you the M2 Max. And actually at that point, if you are considering the entry level, maybe even consider the Mac Mini with an M2 and save a lot more money as well. But Mac Mini versus Mac Studio is a question for another video. Today, I just want to see what this spec'd out M2 Ultra monster is capable of, because this is the first time we've seen this new chip, which is essentially two M2 Maxes glued together. Apple call it Ultra Fusion, but I'm pretty sure it's just super glue. And so we're talking double the CPU, double the GPU, and double the neural engine cores, plus double the media encoder and decoders. So we're talking 134 billion transistors with the M2 Ultra versus 67 billion with the M2 Max. And also this can come with up to 192 gigs of memory versus 96. So in theory, the M2 Ultra should be around twice as fast as the M2 Max. Now sadly, I don't have a Mac Studio with the Max to test that out right now. I only have this one Ultra sample from Apple, but what I do have is this, a MacBook Pro 16 with an M2 Max and 64 gigs of memory. And while it's not obviously a like for like because that's a desktop, this is a laptop, and so of course there are thermal and cooling advantages with this. Also it has way more RAM. You can technically get this with 96 gigs, I've got 64 here, but I am still curious just how much faster this M2 Ultra is, and as this is my workhorse, my everyday laptop, and basically the most powerful MacBook Pro you can buy, I'm kind of curious, how much faster is the Mac Studio, or is this good enough? Well, let's fire up some benchmarks and put it to the test. And starting with the Blender benchmark, the M2 Ultra is literally twice as fast. And so straight away, if Blender is your program of choice for you or your business, maybe the Ultra is worth it. Now, if you're regular on the channel, you know that Premiere Pro is more my gig. And yes, I know I should switch to Final Cut or DaVinci Resolve. I know, but you're not my mother, you can't tell me what to do. And to be fair, it is still the case that much of the professional editing industry do still use Premiere Pro. And in the Puget benchmark, we're looking at anywhere between a 35 and 75% uptick with the M2 Ultra, with the biggest increase coming from the GPU. And then in terms of exporting a video, I've got my 10-minute 4K 60 H.264 project here, and exporting with the YouTube 4K preset, max depth, max render settings of course, my MacBook Pro took 7 minutes and 27 seconds, whereas the Mac Studio took 5 minutes and 24 seconds. And it stayed nearly silent the whole time, whereas my MacBook fans were up and get quite noisy. Jumping over to Lightroom, and the Mac Studio was around 40% faster converting and exporting 100 raw photos to JPEG, and then in Photoshop, a simple focus stacking with a couple of 12 megapixel photos was around 75% faster on the Mac Studio. Now bear in mind, I'm not editing 8K footage here, I'm not working with gigapixel images or anything crazy like that. But even with my workloads, I'm seeing some pretty significant speed increases. Now obviously for me, focus stacking that takes 3 seconds versus 1.5 seconds or something, it doesn't save me a whole lot of time. But if you're working with much bigger files and you're doing it every day, then those 50, 75, 100% speed increases really will add up. Switching gears and booting up a bit of Shadow of the Tomb Raider, at 1080p with maxed out settings, the MacBook Pro with M2 Max averaged 105 FPS, while the Mac Studio with the M2 Ultra averaged 144 FPS. So around a 37% uptick there, but it was also dead quiet throughout. And finally, in Geekbench 6.1, the single-core score is practically the same, but it is a good 50% faster in multi-core and also the OpenCL graphics tests. But again, this is testing a desktop, essentially, versus a MacBook, so it's not a like-for-like, an apples-to-apples, if you will, comparison. And if you are a 3D visual artist, or movie editor, or game designer, or you do actually have 22 streams of 8K ProRes that you want to play back simultaneously in Final Cut, as Apple like to demonstrate, then you are definitely going to be at home here. For me, that's a little bit excessive, but I do definitely appreciate the faster export times or the faster warp stabilizing in Premiere, and I can have every app and program and probably 1,000 Chrome tabs all open and running at the same time without this thing even breaking a sweat. And if you do have very deep pockets, then you can get up to 192 gigs of memory with this. The M2 Max tops out at 96, and also the memory bandwidth is doubled from 400 to 800 gigabytes per second. The M2 Ultra also gets double the RAM and storage as standard, and also the front ports here are actually a little bit better. They're both Thunderbolt with the M2 Ultra, whereas on the M2 Max, these guys are just 10 gigabits per second USB-Cs. And the other advantage when it comes to the displays you're using is the M2 Ultra can output up to 6K displays at 60 Hz simultaneously, whereas the M2 Max supports just 4 6K 60 displays. Probably not something you're going to have to worry about. The downsides of the M2 Ultra, one is that it's heavier. This is 3.7 kilograms versus 2.6, so it is noticeably denser, but I'm not quite sure how often you're going to be moving this thing around, and you can still carry it in a backpack. The biggest issue, of course, is the price. The Mac Studio starts from $2,000 or £2,100 with an M2 Max, but if you opt for the M2 Ultra chip, it adds another $1,500, although that does also double the RAM and storage, which are usually around $250 each as individual upgrades. So I reckon this is probably the spec I would go for if I wanted to spend £4,000 or so on a new Mac Studio. And I get it, it is easy to roll your eyes and just be like, ugh, classic Apple when you talk about those kind of prices, but this is not for the average person. That is the Mac Mini, that is the MacBook Air. This is a high-end prosumer / professional workstation. If you are on a tighter budget and don't need quite that performance, then still definitely consider the M2 Mac Mini. And then at the opposite end of the spectrum, we have the new Mac Pro desktop, and comes with an M2 Ultra as standard. And the main advantage with that is we get PCIe 4 expandability, whether it's storage or networking or media cards, whatever you like, although expandable storage does sound nice. Obviously you can't upgrade this once you buy it, except for, well, hooking up external SSDs or maybe connecting it to a NAS drive. Speaking of which, I also appreciate how many ports we have with this thing. 6 Thunderbolt 4s, we have a 10 gigabit Ethernet, 2 USB-As, a UHS 2 SD card reader, headphone jack, and new for this year, as I say, we have Wi-Fi 6E and HDMI 2.1. So in this setup, I've got the 27-inch 5K Apple Studio display, which is very nice. It's got the nano etched glass, and also the height stand adjustment, which is all horribly expensive. This is like $2,000 all in, and it is only 60 Hz, which is frustrating coming from my 120 Hz ProMotion MacBook Pro, but that is, again, a conversation for another video. Here, I just have a single Thunderbolt 4 cable, nice and easy, but a lot of monitors I like to use that are high resolution and high refresh use HDMI. They may not have a Thunderbolt port, and so previously with the HDMI 2 port on last year's Mac Studio, I was limited to 4K 60. Now with this 2.1, or technically what Apple are calling the enhanced HDMI, it now supports 4K at 240 Hz or 8K at 60. All this from this little incredibly dense box. Picking it up, it does feel a bit like a brick, a very smooth, beautifully rounded brick, but the footprint isn't that much bigger than my hand. I've also had this for a little under a week now, and most of the time it's been completely silent. Only once or twice during benchmarks I heard the slightest fan noise, but it was barely noticeable. And it does also have a speaker built in, which is handy for the boot up sounds and as a backup if you have nothing else. So despite its very unassuming appearance, this is a monster in terms of performance, and really it is overkill for the vast majority of us. I think if you can utilize it, and if you can afford it, it's a great option. And looking at Intel and AMD and Nvidia rivals, how often do we get a 50 to 100% boost in performance with a new chip? Probably not worth the upgrade if you have last year's Mac Studio or a recent MacBook Pro, but if you've got anything older, or heaven forbid you're still on an Intel-powered Mac, then stop what you're doing and buy that, or something similar. But what do you reckon? Would you be tempted to buy something like this, and what would you use it for? Editing, rendering, playing Cyberpunk with their Proton emulation and seeing how that goes? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you so much for watching, guys. If you enjoyed this video, a like and subscribe would be incredible, and I'll see you next time right here on the Tech Chat.